Welcome back, and now with our guest today, Joe Hildebrand, who I said is a very interesting man. I think he's an interesting man. Will you comment? Will you troll us? Will you suggest things to us? We'd love that. Joe, welcome.
Great to be here, my friend. How are you?
You're the best leftie I know.
That's right, I know.
Now,
people get very confused. I don't like to call myself a leftie. I call myself Labor right.
Labor right.
We like that.
I've never known Labor to be right about anything.
No, there's some true patriots in there still.
Now,
yes.
Joe, after the recent by-election down there and the win as it went, without going over all that again, and now what's happening with Hollie Hughes and Tina McQueen, it would seem going on the orange train. What are your thoughts about after that election, which seemed to change things?
Yeah, it definitely has changed things. I think there's a few things going on. The thing that most concerns me is the shift, not necessarily from the Libs or the Nats to One Nation, which in a sense is just a carve up of the same pie, but that working class vote going to One Nation from the Labor Party.
Yes.
And I think that's what Labor needs to be really, really worried about. I know it is worried about it. And again, if we are losing good, honest, working class, blue collar people from the Labor Party to One Nation, that is a real transfer of power. And it's also, I think, a moral abrogation of the Labor Parties. I mean, the clue's in the name, isn't it? It's meant to be the Labor Party. If the Labor Party is not representing working class people, then what's the point of it? So
what I like, Joe, about Pauline, a lot of things, but she will answer a question. These days when a politician, left or right, is asked a question, they waffle. The answer should be yes or no. Pauline answers yes or no. Why do they waffle?
Because it's spin, right?
Yeah, and I think we often say, I mean, again, we're all guilty of it, including in the media, but we say, oh, our politicians waffle, they don't give a straight answer, they're too beige, and yet any time they step outside the box and do say anything kind of colourful or whatever, they get smashed up for it. And I think people really do want that, but I think and Pauline is an example of that, you know. Every time she did speak frankly or say stuff that was controversial or un-PC or whatever, everyone had jumped down her throat and say, you're a racist, how dare you, blah, 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 blah. And now we're seeing it's kind of hit that, you know, critical mass, if you like, where actually everyone's going, actually, no, I do want someone who can say that. Even if they don't agree with what she says, they like the idea. And this is the same thing with Trump as well. People don't necessarily agree with everything that comes out of Trump's mouth, but I think they like the fact that he has the freedom to say it and he's not afraid to say it, and indeed that he's so powerful that he can't be cancelled. And again, this is where I think the new sort of 21st century woke, censorious left that loves to shut people down, loves to get outraged, loves to tell people what they can and can't say. This is where they've done a huge amount of damage to themselves and to, you know, the left more generally. And that's why, you know, I think a lot of working class people who do have real concerns and want to be able to voice them and talk about them, they look at, you know, the Twitter left, if you like, and all these, you know, the new kind of activist left, and thinking, these guys don't speak for me, these guys don't represent me, these guys are against me. I don't even recognise them, and they're obsessed with things that don't matter to me. Yeah,
but what I think as well, Joe, both parties now are picking up on immigration policies, on lots of policies that Pauline has been stating for the last 5 or 10 years. You know, and she's stayed on point to what her beliefs are and her party's beliefs, and the other parties now are grabbing a bit of that. I think it's just a confusion out there in voterland. Does Pauline have some sort of knowledge that these other two major parties don't?
Yeah, I think in many ways, I think, as John Howard once said, the times suit her. So she's sort of, you know, they say a broken clock is still right twice a day. I think that's a little bit unfair on Pauline. I think there's two things. One is years ago, before COVID, before the big sort of drying up and then launch of the migration program, I wrote about there was still a fracturing of the major party vote, so it was still sort of gone from 40-40-20 to about 30-30-30 in terms of coalition, Labor, other. And I actually wrote about how the Liberal Party and the Labor Party had churned through all their leaders, had knifed their prime ministers whenever the going got tough or whenever there was a public backlash to something, and that whether you loved her or hated her, One Nation under Pauline had always had the same. I mean, it did have weird bits where it was out of office and, you know, different people tried to take over and there was all those power games playing out. But as long as it has been a parliamentary force, it has always been Pauline Hanson's One Nation, and she has always been saying pretty much the same thing. And so there was that consistency there that people were looking for and looking towards, even before the big migration boom happened to just really suit everything that Pauline had been saying for so
Is a
long.
lot of this to do with Ashby and his
I think
process of...
I think so. Ashby's obviously very smart, and I think we saw a lot of Barnaby's political nous in the recent Farrer by-election. I think he was a guy who found the candidate, and he's, for all, you know, Barnaby sort of plays up the kind of maverick role, persona or whatever, character, but he's actually very, very smart, very, very canny. I mean, Tony Abbott, I think, called him the best retail politician in the country, and we are seeing, you know, in the polls.
The other bit I see in all this is the fact that people, and I've said this a million times, people are sick and tired of the duopoly between Labor and Liberal.
Yeah.
Okay, at the end of the day, they can't even distinguish between Labor and Liberal because of all this wokeism that's grown. What people are looking for is change, and whether that is good change or bad change, or whatever it is, Pauline Hanson represents change.
I think that's
and
right.
they vote for it.
And she represents protest as well. She represents flipping the bird to the establishment. And I think I always say all good governments look the same, right? And there's a reason why, you know, Labor and the coalition end up kind of in the middle of politics. And what has happened, though, I think, is that there has been that developed into a kind of political class, which was, so instead of sort of left and right, and people would sort of choose between them, it kind of became, you know, the centre, but an elite class that sort of didn't bring people with it and didn't take people with it. So you saw, you know, in the 90s, 80s and 90s and stuff, you know, globalisation, deregulation, you know, a reduction in tariffs. Now all these things ended up being good for working people, and we, you know, I mean, talking about budgets, you know, when Paul Keating came in, you know, the top tax rate was like 60% or whatever, and he brought it down to 45 or whatever it was. But
47, mate.
47, and you know,
Random
that's
question,
all
Joe.
a good thing. And tariffs are not good, as we have seen from Donald Trump. But you know, there is anxiety among workers who are being told that they have to sacrifice their jobs for the sake of progress or whatever. And if you are not connecting with them and making sure that they are looked after, or making sure they understand what is happening and that they're not being left on the slag heap, then they will go to anyone but the duopoly or anyone but the major parties and just say F you. And does One Nation have the solution to those things? It doesn't, but you can certainly understand why people are looking anywhere but, because when they're stressed and they don't feel like the government is listening to them, then they will do whatever it takes to get the government's attention.
Can we talk about a couple of very hot issues that this government is responsible for?
Yep.
One, the tobacco tax. They've created a whole new class of organised crime. They won't admit to it. They've done nothing about it and continue to do nothing about it, right? The other one, the NDIS. 13 billion was the original budget. It went to over 50 billion. There's one person, one NDIS outlet for every 15 people in Lakemba. They do nothing about that except to say, we're changing the way people apply for the NDIS. And the only people who suffer when that happens are the people who actually need it. Rather than going out and prosecuting and getting these people involved in organised crime and putting them behind bars. Why are they?
They are going after them, and they have prosecuted a lot of them, but it's not enough. And the truth is that the whole thing was able to grow far faster and without the necessary restraints that it should have had all along. Again, not wanting to be the guy who says "I told you so," but I warned about this when it was being created, and it's a bit like the Voice campaign, where people said, "All right, you've got community support for this kind of core thing," and then a bunch of sort of activists or whatever said, "Well, let's just chuck everything else in it as well, and we'll just make it bigger and bigger and bigger and get everything we can now because we might not ever get this chance again."
It was a bit like the pig bats.
Yeah,
that rort is similar to the NDS
a bit like that.
In the pink bats, people weren't going to other places and torturing them and killing them. We've got murder, we've got mayhem on the streets. Neighbourhoods.
This is with tobacco, not the NDIS.
Tobacco, yeah. The NDIS is a joke.
The problem with the NDIS, and again, this was something that the coalition government actually did, but they basically just said, look, all you need is this autism diagnosis, an autism type 2 diagnosis, and that's all you need. You don't actually have to prove anything more than that. And I know this all too well, because my best mate is quadriplegic, and he is just beside himself. Like the ridiculous amount of red tape that he has to go through to get literally life-saving help.
He has to go through it because everyone's rorting the system.
Because that's right. So the vast majority of the NDIS stuff.
I personally have relatives who are in need of the NDIS and they receive help out of it. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm a full supporter of what the NDIS can do to the people who actually need it.
That's right. Well, you know what the NDIS started out as? It was meant to be, so in Victoria they have a thing called the Transport Accident Commission, which means that if you are in, and again, one of my best mates was in this scenario, is in a motorcycle accident, and they have a no-fault compensation scheme. So if you're in a horrible car accident and you're left, like he was, brain damaged, half blind, unable to properly walk, whatever, it has a no-fault compensation scheme. So the government says, right, we will give you what you need to be able to live your life, right? And then, so you then have a weird situation where that happens if you're in a car accident, but if you're in any other kind of accident, so you fall off a building, you get squat. And so people started to think, well, all right, this clearly isn't fair. How can we make sure that if you're catastrophically injured, you actually get some kind of support? And that was basically the model on which the NDIS was going to be built. And then it sort of, again, got bigger and bigger. So, all right, what if it's not a car accident? All right, what if it's not an accident at all? What if you're born with it? What if it's not a physical disability? What if it's a mental disability? And so, there was a call towards, when Bill Shorten was still the minister, for people to add ADHD to national disability insurance. It's like, okay, well, why not just make it everybody? And of course, everyone's got different conditions, and we need to make sure people get whatever help.
It comes down
But sooner or later, you just
policing the system. That's what I'm saying.
And making sure the people who need it most
get
are the ones who are getting it, and those who can get by without it and don't need it, don't have it. Like, we've got members of our family who, could easily get a diagnosis, but we haven't, and because we can get by without it.
Wasn't it that the mother of that young boy that died in that scaffolding accident? There was a young 19-year-old boy working on a building site, scaffolding that was inappropriately erected, came down and killed the young boy. And I think that mother fought a lot of his claims for compensation on an accident on a building site, could be covered as well as motor accidents.
Yeah, that's right. So the point being, I suppose, is that this was not meant to be, and again, it went from a scheme where, and again, you had, and I know this firsthand because I've had, again, mates of mine saying, hey, you can get all this other stuff as well. And so, no, I didn't ask for that. I don't need that. I just want what I need. But of course, there'll be other people who...
That's my point, Joe. My point
that's what they're cracking down on, so that's what...
What now? After they've spent another 37 or 38 billion over what they're supposed to spend, it takes them that long to find out there's a rot going on.
Yeah, I think part of the problem was that under the coalition, they were scared to do it because it looked like they were picking on disabled people, because that's what Labor said they were doing every time they tried to cut it. So they didn't do anything. In fact, they expanded it. And then Bill Shorten did some good work while he was minister, and cracking down on especially the Rauders and refusing to put ADHD in there, and basically what Mark Butler is doing now is basically implementing and finishing off what Shorten started, but it has taken a long time.
It's taken a long time. It's taken a lot of taxpayer money, that's for sure. And the tobacco industry, the way...
Well, that's what, yeah.
I mean, there was a story this morning, 10 million cigarettes a day is what Border Control are pulling up. They say that it costs $250,000 for an illegal importer to bring in a container load of cigarettes. Yeah. With a $250,000 investment, they make 10 million. 10 million.
That's right.
So they can afford for 10 million cigarettes, which is basically a container, to go to the border control. The other thousands, tens of thousands of containers that are coming through, no problem. Because we all know that as far as border control is concerned, the containers aren't all looked at. There's probably less than 1% of what comes into our country is actually inspected.
Yeah, that's right. So you've created a margin for profit that is so huge that these guys can afford to get caught. You can never catch up.
But Joe, the thing is, the government has lost all that revenue from the tobacco tax. You know, they were making 10 or $11 billion, whatever it was. Now they're down to less than half that. Yet, in the same token, they've increased the organised crime. Have been able to make billions and continue to make billions. People are losing their lives, they're losing their livelihood, they're losing their property because of how organised criminals conduct themselves. And yet the government seems to turn a blind eye. All they have to do is go back, reduce the tariff or the taxes on the tobacco products, and bring back the status quo. They won't do it.
Yeah, I think they've definitely stuffed it up, and I've never been a big fan of sin taxes, just punishing people who are addicted to stuff, or I've never liked the idea of a sugar tax either. The problem, so what you had with the government, just thought, right, firstly the reasoning was, we spend so much money taking care of people who, smoke themselves to death and end up in hospital and lost productivity because they're not going to work because they're sick or unhealthy or whatever. And so we need to recoup all that back from the big evil tobacco manufacturers. And they've now recouped far more than that. So it's now more than payment. And they thought, we'll just get all of it. And of course you end up prohibition, which is what it is by any other name, pricing it out of affordability. It doesn't work, and people just end up, if people are addicted to something, they're going to find a way to get it, and they're going to find a way to get it for as little as possible. Even with the increase, I talked to the head of the Convenience Stores Association, people jack up the price of cigarettes and say, well, people don't stop buying cigarettes, they just stop buying all the other stuff. So instead of coming into a loaf of bread and a bottle of milk and their smokes, they just come and have the smoke. So it's worse for people.
I'm going to give Joe a break. He hasn't stopped speaking for the last 10 minutes, so he's going to have a break and a coffee. I'm going to ask Joe a random question, so I'm kind of setting it up for him to give you the answer. Does Joe Hildebrand have a political something going on in his hand to put his hand up? Maybe for the Labor Party, maybe for Pauline, who knows? We're going to come back.